Hello, today we'll be doing dealing with issues with human participants. This is the issues PY3 essay, and we are on page 57 of the textbook. And dealing with deception, dealing with confidentiality, dealing with the right to withdraw, and then debriefing. Now, within our essay, we'll be looking at these four main ways of dealing with ethical issues. We'll be looking at debriefing, presumptive consent, ethical committees, and ethical guidelines by the American Psychological Association or the British Psychological Society. Now, have a little ponder and try to recall what debriefing is. Now, Cardwell in 2003 defines debriefing as a post-experimenter interview in which the experimenter tries to restore the participant to the same psychological state they were in when they entered the experiment, but as a result they'll be meeting the requirements of the BPS ethical guidelines. Now, debriefing is an important part of psychological research, especially when some form of deception or physical or psychological harm has occurred. Now, debriefing participants has two functions. Its aim is to restore participants to the same state they were in when they entered the investigation, and it could help a good researcher to regard participants as colleagues and not as objects to meet the ends of the research. So they are actually looking at the participants as humans and seeing if they are okay and whether or not they can do something to obviously help them if they have suffered any psychological or physical harm as a result of their research. However, debriefing does not provide a justification for any unethical aspects of the investigation. It is often seen as adequate merely to inform participants of the true nature of the investigation, but at other times this would be seen as insufficient. So it's not just enough just to throw a debrief at the end of an experiment. They need to ensure that obviously the participants are throughout the whole of the research treated fairly. So therefore, informed consent needs to be thrown in before a debriefing should really happen. It's not sufficient enough just to throw a debriefing at the end of research where deception has occurred, because this is obviously not a complete justification for the other unethical implications or aspects of a piece of research. As stated here, if a participant is traumatised during research, and merely debriefing them about what a study was all about would not resolve this issue. So debriefing in this case would be insufficient and it would not help the participant or be seeing them or treating them as a colleague rather than an object. Now take a few seconds to ponder this question. What impact can debriefing have on participants? Now, the impact it could have is it could lead to the participant being embarrassed by their actions. So, for example, nurses in Rosenhan's research had their trust abused and would have felt like a failure in their job and would question the authenticity of future patients as a result of this research once they've been debriefed about what was happening and the true nature of the research as well. Now, once a participant has been debriefed, they can give retrospective consent, so they can consent to the research once that debriefing has been completed. Or they could use their right to withdraw from the experiment, meaning that obviously all the data that they've contributed to the overall result will be nullified and will not contribute to the researcher's final report. However, this does not prevent the negative impacts of the deception prior to the debriefing. So the embarrassment still could continue and the psychological harm could remain, even though their data is no longer present within the experiments. Now, dealing with the lack of informed consent. So each participant must give their consent to take part. If this is not possible, presumptive consent or prior general consent must be sought and then a debrief must be given. So a debrief here, as you can see, if we're going to use presumptive consent as our main part of our essay, a debrief must still also follow. So it must be relatively effective to be included within another resolution in terms of dealing with ethical issues here. Through consent may negate the specific study. For this reason, there are other options that can be used, and we're going to look at and define what presumptive consent means now. Now, presumptive consent is where you take a selection of participants from your chosen target population and ask them about your research and see if they would take part in the study. If they agreed and they said, okay, yes, we would take part in the study, you could then consider it to be a viable option and then assume that everyone within that target population would also then agree to the research. So, for example, if the research was targeted at sixth form students, you would take a sample of sixth form students. If they agree and consent that they would take part in the study, you would assume that this is the same for the target population. So, therefore, your participants, you would assume that they would then naturally agree to participate in the research as well. Now, presumptive consent, the problems with this is it is easier to agree and state that you would do something hypothetically, but in reality you wouldn't really do it. So an example of this is with Milgram. He used this method. He asked participants how many would go to 450 volts, and only 1% said this would be the case. Obviously, therefore, he used the presumptive consent and then deceived his actual participants, and we know that many of them went up to 450 volts. Therefore, this is showing that this method is unreliable and should potentially not be used, and informed consent should be a better option for research. Now, ethical guidelines outline the researcher's responsibility to the participants and advise them what is acceptable and how to solve ethical dilemmas. So these are just clear guidelines as to how they can fix these ethical dilemmas that they might face in their research. The two institutions that we are aware of that have these guidelines in place is the British Psychological Society and the American Psychological Association. Obviously for us, we focused down and we looked at in lesson the other day the British Psychological Society's ethical guidelines, which you have got a copy of in your folder. Now, the problem with these guidelines is that they are general and you cannot expect for these guidelines to cover all the situations. So, this in turn can mean that researchers absolve responsibility because they believe that they have followed the guidelines to the key. Because they are so general, there are often loopholes in them as a result. So therefore, there can be other ethical implications occurring, such as psychological or physical harm, whilst the researchers would argue that they absolved responsibility because they have followed those guidelines which the BPS has outlined. Now, this is shown in Lange and Roden's work with the elderly, who, by following the guidelines, conducted research in a care home, yet by giving only one group responsibility and control, they are committing an injustice to the comparison group who notably deteriorated. Therefore, by this justification here, they can argue to the BPS that they were following the guidelines as described because they are so general, and that they are absolved of any responsibility of that comparison group deteriorating because they have ethically followed what was meant to be done for the research. It could have a damaging effect on their career and livelihood, as well as an irreversible damage done to the participant, as the BPS or APA could ban the psychologist from conducting any future research as a result of this. Now, one way in which universities try to ensure that these experiments and this research that is being conducted by students is ethical is by employing an ethical committee. Now, ethical committees are in place to safeguard against any ethical issues and to largely protect those participants. They will look at the guidelines and look at the ethical considerations and conduct a cost versus benefits analysis. Now, the cost versus benefit analysis is purely looking at the benefits of the research and the costs of the research. So, what will society gain from this research being conducted? And obviously, what are the costs in terms of the participants that take part in that research? If the costs outweigh the benefits, then the research is seemingly unethical. Meanwhile, if the benefits outweigh the cost, then obviously any ethical issues which are there seemingly can be negated because the benefits will have a greater impact on society as a result. Now, the problem with an ethical committee is the process can be flawed as it often involves the subjective interpretation of the research by the committee itself. So they aren't always safeguarding the participants necessarily, because one committee might judge it as unethical, the next may judge it as ethical. Therefore, another institution may pass research which could then lead to psychological harm being conducted or implemented against participants. Experiment has been proposed. So, for instance, Zimbardo's prison experiment was passed by 3 different institutions, yet they could not have predicted the extreme sadistic behaviour acted out by the guards, which led to the severe bad treatment of the prisoners as a result.